The dust devil that tore through the Hayes Ranch on that scorching August afternoon in 1868 was nothing compared to the storm that followed when her father shook hands with Marcus Young and promised their children would marry when they came of age. Margaret Hayes was only 8 years old, standing in her Sunday dress on the porch of their grand ranch house, watching the tall rancher with dark hair and serious eyes clasp her father's hand, while his 10-year-old son stood stiffly beside him in clothes that looked too formal for the California heat. She remembered thinking the boy looked scared, or maybe angry, with his jaw set tight and his green eyes fixed somewhere past the mountains that rose beyond Keeler like ancient sentinels guarding secrets in their shadows. "Come here, Margaret," her father had called, and she walked forward on unsteady legs, her heart pounding because even at 8 she understood that something important was happening, something that would shape the rest of her life in ways she could not yet comprehend. The boy, Marcus Jr., looked at her then, really looked at her, and his expression softened just slightly. He was tall for his age, with sun-darkened skin and freckles across his nose. When he extended his hand toward her the way the adults did, formal and strange, she took it. His palm was warm and rough already from ranch work, and he held her smaller hand gently. "I will keep my word," he said, and those were the first words Marcus Young ever spoke to her. That promise had seemed like a fairy tale then, distant and unreal, the kind of thing adults arranged without thinking about the hearts of children. But Margaret had tucked it away in her mind like a treasure, and over the next 5 years, she saw Marcus occasionally at church services or town gatherings. He always nodded to her with a solemn respect that made her feel older than her years. As she grew from child to girl to the edge of womanhood, she found herself thinking about that promise more and more, wondering what kind of man he was becoming, whether he still remembered those words spoken when he was just 10 years old. Then everything fell apart. The winter of 1873 brought disaster to the Hayes family. Margaret's father had invested heavily in a silver mine that seemed promising, putting up the ranch as collateral, certain that the strike would make them wealthy beyond measure. Instead, the mine collapsed, literally and figuratively. 3 men died in the cave-in, and the investigation revealed that the seam had been playing out for months. Creditors came calling like vultures circling carrion. Her father aged 10 years in 10 days, his face growing gaunt and gray as he realized what he had done. "We will have to leave," her mother said quietly one evening as Margaret listened from the hallway, her ear pressed to the door of her father's study. "There is nothing left. They will take the house, the land, everything." "The young family," her father began, his voice breaking. "The promise I made to Marcus is void," her mother said firmly. "We cannot ask them to honor such an agreement now. We have nothing. Margaret has no dowry, no prospects. It would be shameful to hold them to it." Margaret's heart had cracked open hearing those words. She slid down the wall and sat on the cold floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, and she let herself cry as quietly as she could. Not because she loved Marcus Young exactly. She barely knew him beyond those few encounters and the weight of that childhood promise. But because that promise had been a bright point in her future, something certain in an uncertain world, and now even that was being taken from her. The Hayes family left Keeler 3 weeks later with a single wagon, a pair of tired horses, and whatever possessions they could carry. They did not say goodbye to the young family. Her father was too ashamed, and her mother thought it was kinder to simply disappear rather than face the humiliation of releasing them from the arrangement. Margaret looked back once as they rolled down the dusty Main Street, past the general store and the saloon and the church where she had imagined walking down the aisle one day to meet Marcus at the altar. She wondered if he would hear about their departure, if he would feel relieved to be free of the obligation, or if perhaps some small part of him might feel what she felt, this strange grief for a future that would never be. They went north first to Sacramento, where her father tried and failed to find steady work. The city was crowded and expensive, and they burned through their meager savings in months. Then they moved to a small farming community in the Central Valley, where her father worked as a hired hand and her mother took in washing. Margaret helped however she could, working alongside her mother, her hands growing red and raw from the lye soap and hot water. She was 15 now, then 16, and men started to notice her despite her worn dresses and work-roughened hands. She had her mother's fine features and thick, dark hair that fell in waves down her back when she let it down at night. Her eyes were gray-blue like the sky before a storm, and she had a way of holding herself straight and proud even when everything around her spoke of poverty. Suitors came calling, most of them unsuitable. Farm boys who smelled of manure and had no ambition beyond the next harvest. A widower twice her age with 4 children who needed a mother more than a wife. A traveling salesman who made promises as empty as his sample case. Margaret turned them all away politely but firmly. Her mother worried that she was being too particular given their circumstances, but Margaret could not explain the feeling in her chest, the sense that she was waiting for something, someone, even though logic told her that childhood promise was as dead as her family's fortune. 2 years passed in grinding poverty and hard work. Her father grew bitter and started drinking, which only made everything worse. Her mother's health began to fail from the endless labor. Margaret felt herself hardening, her dreams shrinking to the size of a single room, a reliable roof, enough food to quiet the constant ache in her stomach. She had just turned 18 when her father, drunk and despairing, tried to arrange a marriage for her with a cattle buyer who was passing through. The man was 50 if he was a day, with mean eyes and hands that lingered too long when he touched her shoulder. "No," Margaret said flatly when her father told her. "I will not." "You will do as you are told," her father said, but there was no strength behind the words, only desperation and shame. "I will leave first," Margaret said, and she meant it. "I will go to San Francisco and find work, any work, before I marry that man." Her mother intervened, thank God, and the arrangement fell through, but Margaret knew it was only a matter of time before her father tried again. She began to plan her escape, hoarding the few coins she earned doing mending for neighbors, studying the stagecoach schedules posted at the general store. She would go to San Francisco as she had threatened, or maybe Los Angeles, somewhere big enough to disappear into, to start fresh. Then, on a hot afternoon in July of 1875, 7 years after that dust devil and that promise, Marcus Young rode into the farming community where Margaret lived, asking after the Hayes family. Margaret was hanging laundry when she heard the commotion. It was rare to see a stranger in their small community, rarer still to see one who looked prosperous. She glanced up from the clothesline and saw him sitting tall in the saddle on a fine chestnut horse, his hat shadowing his face as he spoke to Mrs. Henderson next door. Even from a distance, even after 7 years, she knew him. Something in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself, stirred a memory so deep she felt it in her bones. Mrs. Henderson pointed toward Margaret's house, and Marcus turned his horse that direction. Margaret's hands froze on the wet sheet she was holding, water dripping down her forearms. He was 22 now, fully grown, and the boy she remembered had transformed into a man who took her breath away. Broad-shouldered and lean, with that same dark hair visible beneath his hat, those same green eyes that had looked at her with such seriousness when he was 10. He wore good clothes, clean denim and a vest, boots that were dusty from travel but well made. Everything about him spoke of success, of a life so far removed from her current circumstances that she felt shame wash over her like a wave. He saw her and reined in his horse. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the dusty yard. Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she thought she might faint. She wanted to run, to hide, to not have him see her like this, poor and worn and so far from the girl in the Sunday dress on that ranch house porch. But Marcus was dismounting, his movements smooth and sure, and then he was walking toward her with his hat in his hands, and she could not move, could not breathe, could only stand there with her hands dripping wash water and her old dress clinging to her in the heat. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was deeper than she remembered but still had that same quality of certainty. "Margaret Hayes." "Marcus," she managed, her throat tight. "What are you doing here? I have been looking for you," he said simply. "For more than a year, I finally traced you here." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "Why?" He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the sun, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his throat worked as he swallowed. "Because of the promise," he said. "The one I made when I was 10 years old. I meant it then, and I mean it now." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, hot and unexpected. "That promise is void," she said, the words coming out harsh. "My family has nothing. We are nothing. You do not owe us anything." "I do not do this out of obligation to your family," Marcus said, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her knees weak. "I do this because I gave you my word. I said I would keep it, and I will." "You do not even know me," Margaret said desperately. "I was a child. You were a child. People change." "Then let me know you now," Marcus said. "Let me court you properly, if that is what you want. But I did not spend a year searching California to turn around and leave without at least trying to honor what was promised." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to send him away, wanted to protect him from the mess her life had become. But something in her chest was breaking open, some hard shell she had built around her heart to survive the last 7 years, and she found herself nodding before she even realized she was doing it. "All right," she whispered. "All right." Marcus's face transformed with his smile, and she realized she had never really seen him smile before. It softened everything about him, made him look younger and more open. "May I speak to your father?" he asked. Margaret almost laughed at that, bitter and sharp. "If you can find him sober," she said, then immediately regretted her honesty. But Marcus's expression did not change to judgment or disgust. Instead, something like understanding flickered in his eyes. "Things have been hard," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. "Yes," Margaret said, grateful that he did not make her elaborate. Her father was in the house, mercifully sober for once, and when Marcus introduced himself and stated his intentions, Margaret watched her father's face cycle through shock, disbelief, hope, and finally a crushing shame that made her hurt for him despite everything. "I cannot give her anything," her father said, his voice raw. "No dowry, no prospects. I have failed her in every way a father can fail a daughter." "I do not need anything from you, sir," Marcus said with a respect that Margaret found almost painful to witness. "I only need your permission to court your daughter, and if she will have me, to marry her." Her father looked at Margaret, really looked at her for what felt like the first time in months. "Is this what you want?" he asked, and she could hear in his voice that he would let her choose, that despite everything he had not quite given up on being her father. Margaret met Marcus's eyes across the small, shabby room that was such a far cry from the ranch house where they had met. She did not love him, not yet, but she remembered the warmth of his hand holding hers when she was 8, the solemnity of his promise, the fact that he had spent a year searching for her when he could have simply let the promise die with her family's fortune. "Yes," she said. Yes, it is. The courting that followed was unlike anything Margaret had imagined. Marcus had not been exaggerating when he said he wanted to do things properly. He took a room at a boarding house in the nearest town and rode out to see her 3 times a week. He brought small gifts, nothing ostentatious but thoughtful, chosen with care. A book of poetry because she had mentioned once loving to read, a length of blue fabric that matched her eyes, a jar of honey from his ranch because she had said she missed the taste of sweetness. They took walks in the early evening when the heat broke, following the irrigation ditches that crisscrossed the farmland, talking about everything and nothing. Margaret learned that Marcus had grown into a thoughtful, serious man who cared deeply about his land and his responsibilities. He told her about the years after her family left, how he had asked his father about the Hayes family and been told simply that the arrangement was off, that Margaret was gone. "I thought about you, though," Marcus said one evening as they sat on a fallen log at the edge of a wheat field, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "More than I probably should have, given that we barely knew each other. But I remembered that promise, and I remembered your hand in mine, and I kept thinking that one day I would be old enough and established enough to come find you." "Why?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. "You could have any woman you wanted. Your ranch is prosperous, you are respected. Why track down a girl you met once when you were 10 years old?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the horizon. "My father made a lot of promises he did not keep," he said finally. "To my mother before she died, to people who worked for him. He was a good man in many ways, but he was careless with his word. I swore I would not be like that. When I make a promise, I keep it, even if it takes 7 years." "That is a lot of weight to carry," Margaret said softly. "Maybe," Marcus agreed, "but there is more to it than just keeping my word. When I started looking for you, it was about honor, about being the kind of man who follows through. But the more I searched, the more I realized I wanted to find you for another reason entirely. I wanted to know what kind of woman you had become. I wanted to see if there could be something real between us, not just an obligation from our childhood." "And now," Margaret asked, her heart beating fast, "what do you think now that you have found me?" Marcus turned to look at her, and the intensity in his green eyes made her breath catch. "I think I am starting to fall in love with you," he said quietly. "I think I want to wake up every morning and see your face. I think I want to build a life with you, not because our fathers shook hands 7 years ago, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it now that I have found you again." Margaret felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. "I am starting to fall in love with you too," she whispered. "And it terrifies me because I have nothing to offer you, nothing except myself, and I am not sure that is enough." Marcus reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "You are everything," he said fiercely. "Do you understand me, Margaret? You are everything." Then he kissed her, gentle at first and then deeper, and Margaret felt herself melting into him, all the fear and shame and hardness of the past 7 years dissolving in the warmth of his touch. When they finally pulled apart, she was shaking, and Marcus held her close, his arms strong and steady around her. "Marry me," he said against her hair. "Not because of a promise made by our fathers, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." "Yes," Margaret said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed a month later in the small church in the farming community, with Margaret wearing a simple dress that Marcus had commissioned from the dressmaker in town. It was not the grand affair that might have been planned 7 years earlier when both families were prosperous, but Margaret found she did not care. What mattered was the way Marcus looked at her when she walked down the aisle, like she was the most precious thing in the world. What mattered was the steadiness of his voice when he spoke his vows, the warmth of his hand holding hers, the promise of a future that finally felt real and solid instead of distant and dreamlike. Her parents wept through the ceremony, and afterward, her father pulled Marcus aside. Margaret could not hear what was said, but she saw her father's shoulders shake, saw Marcus grasp his hand firmly, saw something pass between them that looked like forgiveness and grace. Her mother held her tight before she left, whispering, "Be happy, my darling girl. You deserve to be happy." Marcus took her back to Keeler, back to the young ranch that was now theirs since his father had passed the previous winter. The house was large and well kept, nothing like the grandeur of the Hayes Ranch in its prime, but comfortable and solid. Marcus carried her over the threshold, and Margaret looked around at the home that would be hers, feeling both overwhelmed and deeply grateful. "I know it is not what you grew up with," Marcus said, watching her face carefully, "but it is ours, and we can make it into whatever you want." "It is perfect," Margaret said honestly. "It is more than I ever dreamed I would have again." That first night as husband and wife was tender and awkward and sweet. Marcus was patient with her nervousness, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. When it was over and they lay tangled together in the darkness, Margaret felt a peace she had not known in years settling into her bones. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for keeping your word." Marcus pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for saying yes," he murmured. "For giving me a chance to prove myself to you." "You have already proven yourself," Margaret said. "You came for me when you did not have to. You saw past the poverty and the shame and the brokenness. You made me believe in promises again." "Then let me make you another promise," Marcus said, pulling back slightly so he could see her face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "I promise to love you every day of my life. I promise to work hard to give you the life you deserve. I promise to be faithful and true and to always, always keep my word to you." "And I promise the same to you," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise to be a good wife, a good partner. I promise to build this life with you and to love you with everything I have." They sealed those promises with another kiss, and Margaret felt the last pieces of her broken heart knit back together. She had been lost, and Marcus had found her. She had been poor, and he had shared his wealth. She had been without hope, and he had given her a future. Not because he had to, but because he had chosen to, because 7 years earlier a 10-year-old boy had looked at an 8-year-old girl and said, "I will keep my word." And he had meant it with a depth and sincerity that had carried them both through years of separation and hardship to this moment, this bed, this beginning. The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Margaret threw herself into learning the rhythms of the ranch, working alongside Marcus from dawn until dusk. She learned to manage the household, to cook for the ranch hands, to keep the books and handle the correspondence. Marcus was patient with her learning curve, never criticizing when she made mistakes, always encouraging her efforts. In return, she brought warmth and life to the house that had been without a woman's touch since his mother's death. But it was not all easy. There were moments when Margaret's pride would flare up, when she would feel the sting of being the charity case, the girl whose family lost everything, and Marcus would have to gently remind her that they were partners now, that what was his was hers, that her past did not define their future. There were nights when Marcus would work himself to exhaustion trying to prove to her that he could provide for her, that she would never want for anything again. And Margaret would have to pull him back, remind him that she did not need grand gestures, only his presence and his love. They learned each other slowly, carefully, building a foundation of trust and affection that grew deeper with each passing day. Margaret discovered that Marcus had a dry sense of humor that surprised her into laughter at unexpected moments. Marcus discovered that Margaret was fiercely intelligent and had opinions about everything from politics to the best way to treat a horse's colic. They debated and discussed and sometimes argued, but always they came back to each other. Always they chose love over pride. 3 months into their marriage, Margaret's mother took ill with pneumonia. Marcus did not hesitate. He arranged for the best doctor he could find to travel to the farming community, paid for the medicine without a second thought. When it became clear that Margaret's mother needed better care than she could receive in the small farmhouse, Marcus insisted they bring both of Margaret's parents to the ranch. "This is your family," he said when Margaret protested that it was too much, too generous. "Which makes them my family. We take care of our own." Her parents arrived on a crisp October afternoon, her mother weak but alive, her father sober and shaken by how close he had come to losing his wife. Marcus set them up in a comfortable room in the house, and treated them with such respect and kindness that Margaret sometimes had to leave the room because her tears would not stop falling. Her mother recovered slowly, and during those weeks of convalescence, Margaret got to have her mother back in a way she had not since before the disaster that had shattered their family. They talked for hours, Margaret telling her mother about her life with Marcus, her mother sharing wisdom about marriage and life and holding on to hope even in the darkest times. "You have chosen well," her mother said one afternoon as they sat together mending clothes. "Or rather, the choice that was made for you all those years ago turned out to be the right one." "He is a good man," Margaret said simply, but the words could not capture the depth of what she felt, the gratitude and love and wonder that this was her life now. Her father, too, began to heal in the safety and stability of the young ranch. He stopped drinking, started helping with small tasks around the property, slowly regaining some of the dignity he had lost. One evening he sought out Marcus in the barn where he was checking on a mare about to foal. "I do not know how to thank you," her father said, his voice gruff with emotion, "for everything you have done for Margaret, for my wife, for me. I do not deserve your kindness." Marcus straightened from examining the mare and regarded the older man steadily. "You are my father-in-law," he said. "Family, that is reason enough." "Still," her father persisted, "I broke the agreement. I failed in every way. You could have walked away, should have walked away. Instead, you searched for her, married her anyway, and now you take care of us as well. I need to know why." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "My own father was a hard man. Fair, but hard. He taught me about honor and keeping your word, but he did not teach me much about mercy or grace. Those things I had to learn on my own. When I finally found Margaret and saw what your family had been through, I realized that life is not about holding people to agreements made in better times. It is about showing up when things are hard. It is about keeping promises not out of obligation but out of love. I love your daughter, sir. Which means I will do everything in my power to care for the people she loves." Her father's eyes filled with tears, and he reached out to grip Marcus's shoulder. "She is lucky to have you," he said hoarsely. "And you have my deepest gratitude, my respect, and my word that I will not squander this second chance you have given us." Marcus nodded, accepting the words with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. "Then let us speak of it no more," he said. "You are family now. This is your home for as long as you need it." As autumn turned to winter, Margaret began to notice changes in her body. The nausea that hit her in the mornings, the tenderness in her breasts, the way certain smells made her stomach turn. She waited to be sure before saying anything to Marcus, but when she missed her monthly courses for the second time, she could no longer deny what was happening. She told him one evening after dinner, when they were alone in their bedroom. She had been nervous about his reaction, uncertain how he would feel about becoming a father so soon in their marriage, But the moment she said the words, "Marcus, I am with child," his face lit up with such pure joy that all her fears evaporated. "Truly?" he asked, his voice almost reverent. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Margaret said, laughing at his expression. "In the spring, I think. Are you happy?" "Happy." Marcus swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests to be careful. "Margaret, I am beyond happy. I am overwhelmed. I am terrified. I am grateful. I am all of it at once." He set her down gently, then dropped to his knees in front of her, pressing his face against her still, flat belly. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I am your father, and I promise to love you and protect you and be the best father I can be. Just as I promised your mother 7 years ago that I would keep my word, I promise you now that I will always be there for you." Margaret ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she whispered. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. Margaret bloomed with health, her skin glowing, her body rounding in ways that made Marcus constantly want to touch her, to marvel at the life they had created together. He became even more protective, insisting she rest more, take on fewer heavy tasks, let him or the ranch hands handle anything strenuous. Margaret tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding that it came from love even when it bordered on excessive. Her parents were overjoyed at the prospect of becoming grandparents. Her mother fussed over her constantly, making sure she ate enough, knitting tiny garments for the baby. Her father built a beautiful cradle from oak, taking his time with every detail, and Margaret cried when he presented it to her, seeing in the careful craftsmanship evidence of his return to himself, his reclamation of his pride and purpose. Spring came early to Keeler in 1876, the hills around the ranch turning green with unexpected rain. Margaret's belly had grown round and full, and she moved with the careful grace of women in the late stages of pregnancy. Marcus had hired a midwife from town to be on call, and as her time drew near, he became increasingly nervous, pacing the house, checking on her constantly. The labor began on a warm April morning when the wildflowers were blooming across the hills in riots of color. Margaret's water broke as she was making breakfast, and she calmly sent one of the ranch hands for the midwife before turning to Marcus, who had gone pale. "It is time," she said, taking his hand. "Stay with me, always," Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly. "I am not going anywhere." The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the day and into the night. Marcus stayed by Margaret's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she was certain she could not endure another moment. The midwife was competent and calm, guiding Margaret through each contraction, assuring her that everything was progressing normally even when Margaret was sure something must be wrong. Finally, as dawn was breaking on a new day, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that announced his arrival to everyone in the house. The midwife placed the baby on Margaret's chest, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect human they had created, and she felt a love so vast and overwhelming that it made everything she had felt before seem small by comparison. "A boy," Marcus said, his voice choked with emotion as he looked at his son. "We have a son." "What should we name him?" Margaret asked, running her finger gently over the baby's downy dark hair. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "What about Matthew, after your grandfather?" Margaret felt fresh tears spring to her eyes. Her grandfather had been a kind man, one of the few bright spots in her childhood memories. "Matthew Young," she said, testing the name. "Yes, that is perfect." They marveled over their son together as the sun rose, counting his tiny fingers and toes, studying his face for signs of who he looked like. He had Marcus's dark hair but Margaret's gray-blue eyes, or at least they thought so, though the midwife laughingly said it was too early to tell. What mattered was that he was healthy and strong and absolutely perfect in every way that counted. Margaret's parents came in to meet their grandson, and her father wept openly as he held the baby, this new generation, this symbol of hope and new beginnings. Her mother kissed Margaret's forehead and said, "You did so well, my darling. I am so proud of you." The weeks that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Margaret was consumed with learning to care for her son, with the endless cycle of feeding and changing and soothing. Marcus was an attentive father, helping whenever he could, taking the baby in the early mornings so Margaret could sleep a bit longer. He would walk the floor with Matthew when the baby was fussy, singing old songs in a surprisingly pleasant baritone, and Margaret would watch them from the bed, her heart aching with love for both of them. As Matthew grew from newborn to infant, Margaret began to settle more fully into her role as wife, mother, and mistress of the ranch. She took over more of the management duties, proving to have a sharp head for business that Marcus greatly appreciated. Together, they made a formidable team, building the ranch into an even more prosperous operation. They bought more land, hired more hands, invested in better breeding stock. The young ranch became known throughout the region for its quality horses and cattle. But more than the material success, what mattered to Margaret was the life they had built together. The home they had created, filled with laughter and love and the everyday joys of family. Matthew's first smile, his first word, his first steps. The way Marcus would come in from a long day of work and scoop his son into his arms, covering his face with kisses. The quiet evenings when they would sit on the porch after Matthew was asleep, holding hands and watching the stars come out over the mountains. Margaret's parents remained on the ranch, becoming integral parts of the household. Her father managed some of the day-to-day operations, freeing Marcus to focus on the bigger picture. Her mother helped with Matthew and the house, and Margaret was grateful every day for their presence, for the second chance they had all been given. 2 years after Matthew was born, Margaret found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and when their daughter was born on a cool October evening, the labor was mercifully shorter. They named her Miranda, and she came into the world with a full head of dark hair and a disposition that was significantly more placid than her brother's had been. Marcus was utterly smitten with his daughter, and Margaret often teased him about how he spoiled her. But she could not really blame him. There was something about seeing this strong, capable man reduced to helpless adoration by a tiny girl that made Margaret fall in love with him all over again. The years passed in the way that years do when you are busy and happy and surrounded by love. Matthew grew into a bright, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, asking endless questions about the ranch and the horses and everything else under the sun. Miranda was quieter but no less determined, with a stubborn streak that Marcus swore she got from her mother. They added another son, Michael, when Matthew was 5. And then 2 years later, twin girls, Melissa and Molly, who kept everyone on their toes with their mischief and energy. The ranch house that had once seemed so large and quiet was now constantly filled with noise and activity. Children running through the halls, dogs barking, ranch hands coming and going. Margaret often thought back to those dark years of poverty and despair and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. She was 30 now, no longer the frightened 18-year-old girl who had stood in a dusty yard, her hands dripping wash water, staring at a man who had come to honor a promise made in childhood. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains, Marcus took her hand and said, "Do you ever think about how different things could have been? If I had not come looking for you, if you had said no, if any number of things had gone differently." Margaret squeezed his hand, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with regret, only with gratitude that things happened the way they did. That you are the kind of man who keeps his promises, even when it would have been easier to forget them." "I could never have forgotten you," Marcus said quietly. "Even if I had tried, you were always there in the back of my mind, a promise waiting to be kept." "And now?" Margaret asked, turning to look at him. "Are you happy with how it all turned out?" Marcus smiled, that same smile that still made her heart skip a beat even after more than a decade together. "Happy does not begin to cover it," he said. "You and the children, this life we have built together. It is more than I ever dreamed of when I was a 10-year-old boy making a promise I only half understood. You are my heart, Margaret. You are my everything." Margaret kissed him then, long and deep, and when they pulled apart, they were both smiling. "And you are mine," she said softly. "My unexpected blessing. The man who found me when I was lost and gave me a reason to believe in promises again." They sat together as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, listening to their children's laughter, feeling the solid weight of the life they had built together. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the grand ranch house of her childhood to the poverty and desperation of her teenage years to this moment, this porch, this man beside her. It had not been an easy path, but it had been worth every hardship, every tear, every moment of doubt, because in the end, Marcus had kept his word. And in keeping it, he had given her not just a home and a family, but a love that was real and deep and true. A love that had started with a childhood promise and had grown into something neither of them could have imagined all those years ago. As their children grew older, the ranch continued to prosper. Matthew, now a young teenager, was already showing signs of being a natural rancher like his father. He had Marcus's steady temperament and work ethic, combined with Margaret's sharp mind for numbers and planning. Marcus began teaching him more complex aspects of ranch management, taking him along on trips to buy and sell stock, introducing him to the business contacts that would serve him well in the future. Miranda, at 12, had developed a fierce love for the horses. She spent every spare moment in the stables, learning everything she could about breeding and training. Marcus indulged this passion, recognizing in his daughter the same determination that had driven him to search for Margaret all those years ago. He began teaching her the finer points of horsemanship, and soon she was riding as well as any of the ranch hands. Michael was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book when he should have been doing chores. Margaret encouraged this, remembering her own love of reading, and she made sure he had access to books from San Francisco and Sacramento. Marcus worried sometimes that Michael was too soft for ranch life, but Margaret reminded him gently that not every child needed to follow the same path. The twins, Melissa and Molly, were now 7 and absolutely inseparable. They had their own language, their own games, and a talent for getting into trouble that kept everyone alert. But they were also sweet-natured and loving, quick to hug and kiss, and they brought a lightness to the household that everyone appreciated. Margaret's parents had aged gracefully on the ranch. Her father, now in his 60s, had become a beloved figure among the ranch hands, always ready with advice or a helping hand. Her mother spent her days tending the garden she had planted, which had grown into a beautiful oasis of flowers and vegetables. They were content, and Margaret was grateful every day that Marcus had insisted on bringing them to the ranch all those years ago. But life, as Margaret had learned, is never static. Change comes whether you are ready for it or not. It was a spring morning in 1888, 13 years after their wedding, when a rider came up the road to the ranch house. He was a lawyer from Sacramento, and the news he brought was both unexpected and life-changing. Margaret's uncle, her father's brother, had died and left his entire estate to Margaret, having no children of his own. The estate was substantial, a large property near Sacramento and a considerable sum of money. Margaret's father wept when he heard the news, not from grief for his brother, with whom he had been estranged for years, but from the overwhelming sense that his family was finally, fully restored. The wealth that had been lost was not just replaced, but exceeded. But Margaret and Marcus looked at each other, and they both knew without speaking that this money would not change anything fundamental about their lives. They were already rich in the ways that mattered. They had each other, they had their children, they had a home and a life they loved. The inheritance was a blessing, certainly, but not the source of their happiness. They decided to use the money to expand the ranch, to buy more land and build better facilities. They set aside a substantial amount for each of their children's futures, ensuring they would have opportunities and choices. They donated to the church and to causes that helped families who were struggling the way Margaret's family had struggled. And they tucked the rest away, secure in the knowledge that their children and grandchildren would never face the kind of desperate poverty that had once defined Margaret's teenage years. As the children grew into young adults, Margaret and Marcus watched with pride and sometimes bittersweet nostalgia. Matthew, at 19, was already running much of the ranch's day-to-day operations. He had fallen in love with the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a smart, capable young woman who reminded Marcus of Margaret. The wedding was planned for the fall. Miranda had announced her intention to start a horse breeding program focused on developing better stock for the region. Marcus was fully supportive, giving her a section of the ranch to use for her venture. At 17, she was already gaining a reputation as an expert horsewoman. Michael, at 14, had expressed interest in becoming a teacher. Margaret encouraged this dream, understanding that not all of her children would stay on the ranch, and that was all right. What mattered was that they found their own paths, their own happiness. The twins were still young, but already showing distinct personalities. Melissa wanted to be a doctor, an ambition that shocked and delighted Margaret in equal measure. Molly was interested in music and had taught herself to play the piano that Marcus had bought for the house. The sounds of her practicing filled the evenings with melody. One night, as Margaret and Marcus lay in bed, he said, "I have been thinking about that day when I found you. Do you remember? You were hanging laundry and you looked so scared when you saw me." Margaret smiled in the darkness. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I thought you were going to see how far I had fallen and ride away as fast as you could." "I almost could not breathe when I saw you," Marcus said quietly. "You were so beautiful, even in your worn dress with your hands red from work. And I knew in that moment that finding you was the most important thing I had ever done." "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked, not because she doubted him, but because she wanted to hear the answer. "Do you ever wish you had married someone from a prosperous family, someone who could have brought you wealth and connections?" Marcus rolled over to face her, cupping her cheek in his hand. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You brought me something far more valuable than wealth or connections. You brought me love, real love, the kind that grows and deepens over years of living and working and raising children together. You made me a better man, Margaret. You made me understand that keeping a promise is not just about honor. It is about choosing love over convenience, about showing up when it would be easier to walk away. I would choose you 1,000 times over in any circumstances." Margaret felt tears slide down her cheeks onto the pillow. "I love you," she whispered. "I have loved you since the day you told me you had been searching for me, that you meant to keep your promise. But I love you more now than I did then, more than I thought possible. You gave me back my life, Marcus. You gave me hope when I had none left." They made love then, slow and tender, with the familiarity of long marriage but also with a passion that had never dimmed. Afterwards, they lay tangled together, and Margaret thought about the years that had brought them to this moment. The childhood promise that had seemed like a fairy tale. The catastrophe that had torn her family apart. The desperate years of poverty. Marcus's arrival like an answer to prayers she had been too afraid to pray. Their wedding, their children, the life they had built together from nothing but determination and love. She thought about how different her life would have been if Marcus had not kept his word. She would have married someone else, or perhaps never married at all. She would not have these children, this home, this deep, abiding happiness that sustained her through every challenge and celebrated with her through every joy. But Marcus had kept his word. And in doing so, he had taught her something profound about the nature of promises and love. That true commitment is not about binding yourself to someone in good times and then abandoning them when circumstances change. It is about choosing to honor your commitments, especially when it would be easier not to. It is about seeing value in a person beyond their circumstances. It is about keeping your word not because you have to, but because you want to, because the promise itself has become precious. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Matthew married his sweetheart and eventually took over full management of the ranch when Marcus decided it was time to step back. He and his wife gave Margaret and Marcus their first grandchildren, twin boys who reminded everyone of Matthew and Michael at that age. Miranda's horse breeding program became renowned throughout California, and she received offers to sell her stock from as far away as Texas and Montana. She married a veterinarian who shared her passion for horses, and together they built a legacy that would last for generations. Michael did become a teacher, opening a school in Keeler that served the children of ranch families and townspeople alike. He married a woman who had been a teacher herself, and together they made education accessible to children who might not otherwise have had the opportunity. Melissa, true to her childhood dream, went to medical school in San Francisco, one of the few women to do so. She returned to Keeler to practice, becoming the first female doctor in the region. Molly pursued music, studying in Sacramento, and eventually becoming a piano teacher, filling the town with the sound of her students practicing. Margaret's parents lived to see all of their grandchildren grown, and several of their great-grandchildren born. When they passed, first her father, and then, 6 months later, her mother, it was peacefully in the home that Marcus had given them, surrounded by family. Margaret grieved but also felt grateful that they had been able to spend their final years in comfort and dignity. That the hardships of those terrible years after they lost everything had not been the end of their story. As Margaret and Marcus entered their 50s, and then their 60s, they gradually transitioned from the active management of the ranch to advisory roles, letting the younger generation take the lead. They spent their time with grandchildren, traveled to places they had always wanted to see, and simply enjoyed the peace that comes from a life well lived. One evening, when they were both 65 years old, they sat on the porch where they had spent so many evenings over the past 4 decades. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in those same shades of orange and pink that Margaret remembered from her first years on the ranch. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard under the watchful eyes of their parents, and the sounds of laughter and life filled the air. "Do you remember what I promised you on our wedding night?" Marcus asked, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. "You made several promises," Margaret said with a smile. "Which one are you referring to?" "I promised to love you every day of my life," Marcus said. "To work hard to give you the life you deserved, to be faithful and true, and to always keep my word to you." "You have kept every one of those promises," Margaret said softly, squeezing his hand. "Every single day for 40 years. "And I will keep them for however many days we have left," Marcus said. "Until my last breath, Margaret. That is my promise to you." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness that had been her anchor for 4 decades. "And I have kept mine to you," she said. "To be a good wife, a good partner, to build this life with you and to love you with everything I have. It has been the greatest honor of my life, Marcus Young, being your wife, raising our children, building this family with you." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding vows, the birth of each of their children, the countless moments of joy and sorrow and everyday living that had woven together to create the tapestry of their life. Marcus thought about that 10-year-old boy who had shaken hands with a man and promised to marry his daughter. He had not understood then what that promise would mean, what it would require of him, what it would give him. He had only known that when you give your word, you keep it. But he understood now. He understood that the promise had been the beginning of the greatest adventure of his life. That searching for Margaret, finding her, loving her, building a life with her had been the defining purpose of his existence. That every sacrifice, every challenge, every moment of doubt had been worth it for the privilege of calling her his wife. Margaret thought about that 8-year-old girl in the Sunday dress, watching her father shake hands with a stranger and wondering what it all meant. She had been so young, so innocent, with no idea of the trials that lay ahead or the love that would eventually redeem them all. She thought about the girl she had been at 18, poor and desperate and certain that her life was over before it had really begun. She thought about the moment she looked up from hanging laundry and saw Marcus riding toward her, and how her heart had known, even before her mind accepted it, that her life was about to change forever. She thought about every moment since then, the thousands of days that had added up to a lifetime. The first time Marcus had told her he loved her, their wedding day, the births of each of their children, the quiet mornings and busy afternoons and peaceful evenings, the arguments and the reconciliations, the challenges overcome, and the victories celebrated. All of it, every single moment, had been leading to this, sitting on a porch with the man she loved, watching their legacy play out before them in the laughter of grandchildren, and the success of children who had grown into remarkable adults. "Thank you," Margaret said suddenly, and Marcus turned to look at her with a question in his eyes. "Thank you for being the kind of man who keeps his promises. Thank you for searching for me when you could have moved on. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me when I had nothing. Thank you for loving me every day for 40 years. Thank you for this life, these children, this family. Thank you for everything." Marcus's eyes grew bright with emotion and he pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for saying yes," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you for taking a chance on a man who showed up out of nowhere with nothing but a childhood promise and a determination to keep it. Thank you for building this life with me, for being my partner in everything. Thank you for loving me even when I was difficult or stubborn or too focused on work. Thank you for being the best mother our children could have asked for. Thank you for being you, Margaret, just exactly as you are." They held each other as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who had been brought together by a promise made in childhood, separated by catastrophe, and reunited by determination and love. Two people who had chosen, every day for 40 years, to honor their commitments to each other, to work through the challenges, to celebrate the joys, to build something lasting and beautiful and true. Their story, which had begun with a dust devil and a handshake, with a 10-year-old boy looking at an 8-year-old girl and saying, "I will keep my word," had unfolded into a legacy that would endure for generations. Their children carried forward the values they had modeled, the importance of keeping promises, of choosing love, of working hard and being faithful, and never giving up on the people you care about. As the years went on, Marcus and Margaret continued to be fixtures in the family and the community, respected and beloved by everyone who knew them. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. And the party that Matthew and Miranda organized was the social event of the season in Keeler. When they were in their early 70s, Marcus's health began to decline. It was nothing specific, just the general wearing out of a body that had worked hard for decades. Margaret nursed him with the same devotion he had shown her throughout their marriage, and even in his weakness, he would reach for her hand and tell her he loved her. "Do you have any regrets?" Margaret asked him one afternoon as they sat together in their bedroom, the sounds of the ranch drifting through the open window. Marcus thought for a long moment, then shook his head. "Not a one," he said firmly. "I lived the life I wanted to live. I kept my promises. I loved you with everything I had. I raised children who make me proud. I built something lasting. What more could a man ask for, to live forever?" Margaret suggested with a small smile, though her eyes were wet with tears. Marcus squeezed her hand. "I would not want forever," he said. "Just this, just you, just the life we have had together. That is enough, Margaret, more than enough." When Marcus passed peacefully in his sleep a few weeks later with Margaret beside him holding his hand, the entire region mourned. The church could not hold all the people who came to pay their respects, to share stories of his kindness, his integrity, his generosity. But for Margaret, the greatest tribute was the love of her children, who gathered around her and held her as she grieved the loss of the man who had defined her life for more than 50 years. In the months that followed, Margaret found solace in her family and in the memories of the life she and Marcus had built together. She remained active and engaged, watching her grandchildren grow, seeing her great-grandchildren take their first steps. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the promise he had kept, about the kind of man he had been. She lived to be 87 years old, and when she finally joined Marcus, it was with the same peacefulness that had characterized his passing. Her children found her in her bed, a smile on her face, her hand positioned as if she were holding someone else's hand. On her nightstand was an old photograph from their wedding day, Marcus looking serious and steady, Margaret looking radiant with hope. They buried her next to Marcus on a hill overlooking the ranch, and the entire family gathered to say goodbye to the woman who had been the heart of their family, who had taught them about resilience and love, and the importance of keeping promises. The headstone they placed marked both graves, and beneath their names and dates was a simple inscription that Margaret herself had requested years earlier. They were promised as children. He found her and kept his word. They loved faithfully until the end. The ranch continued under the management of their descendants, each generation adding to the legacy that Marcus and Margaret had begun. The story of their love, of the childhood promise kept, of the man who searched for a year to find the girl he had been promised to and married her despite her poverty, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. And in the telling, the story became more than just a romantic tale. It became a lesson about the nature of commitment, about choosing love over convenience, about honoring your word even when circumstances change. It became a reminder that the best things in life often come from keeping promises, even when those promises are made when you are too young to fully understand what they mean. Marcus and Margaret's love story, which began with a dust devil and a handshake in 1868, endured long after both of them were gone. It lived on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It lived on in the ranch that still bore the young name. It lived on in the values they had instilled, the lessons they had taught, the example they had set. And perhaps most importantly, it lived on as proof that true love is not just about feeling, though feeling matters. It is about choice, about commitment, about showing up day after day and choosing to honor the promises you have made. It is about seeing value in a person beyond their circumstances. It is about keeping your word not because you have to, but because you want to, because the promise itself has become precious, because the person you made the promise to has become your everything. That was the legacy Marcus and Margaret Young left behind. A legacy of faithful love and kept promises that enriched not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. And in the end, that was more valuable than all the silver mines in California, more lasting than any material wealth, more precious than anything else they could have given to the world. Their story was complete, their promises kept, their love proven through decades of living and working and raising a family together. And though they were gone, what they had built together, what they had created through determination and love and faithful commitment, endured. The dust devils still swirled across the ranch on hot August afternoons, stirring up memories of that day in 1868 when two fathers shook hands and promised their children to each other. But now those dust devils swept past a thriving ranch, past fields full of horses that bore the bloodlines Miranda had developed, past the school that Michael had founded, past the home where multiple generations had been born and raised. They swept past the graves on the hill where Marcus and Margaret rested side by side, their story complete, their promises kept, their love enduring even beyond death. And in the sweeping of those dust devils, there was a whisper of something eternal, something that spoke to the power of keeping your word, of honoring your commitments, of choosing love even when it would be easier to walk away. That was the story of Marcus and Margaret Young. A story that began with a promise and ended with a legacy. A story of love that was tested and proven true. A story that would be told and retold for generations, inspiring others to keep their promises, to honor their commitments, to choose love faithfully and well. And it was, in every way that mattered, a story with a happy ending, because in the end they had what they had always wanted, what they had worked for, what they had built together. They had each other, they had their family, they had a love that had sustained them through every challenge and celebrated with them through every joy. They had kept their promises to each other, from that first childhood pledge to the wedding vows to the everyday choices to love and honor each other, until death parted them. And now, even death had brought them back together, resting side by side for eternity, their story complete, their love proven, their promises kept. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.